So I recently went on a family vacation to the Bahamas, which was very nice. And while I was out there, I was able to get some reading done. And yeah, I finished off one novel that I had already started before I left. And I also read through one graphic novel. And I thought it would be nice to come on here and just talk about both of them, just in brief. And the first one I'm going to be talking about is the book Chocky by John Wynbdham. I picked this book up because I'd heard that David Bowie had been a fan of Wynbdham, particularly around the time that he was working on the music for his album Hunky Dory. And Chocky isn't the book that was inspiring him during those days. He was more into a book called The Midwich Cuckoos, also written by Wynbdham, that also looks quite good. I think I may want to pick that one up as well at some point. But that's how I learned about Wynbdham anyway. And after I took a look at his career and just, going through it and seeing what I liked, I ended up choosing Chocky for myself just because the premise spoke to me a little bit more. And, it's more of an isolated story. Chocky is a sci-fi about a young boy named Matthew who has this imaginary friend called Chocky. And it starts out innocently enough, He's behaving just like any other kid who you might catch talking to themselves. But it's not long before the nature of these private conversations that he's having start to become a little bit more concerning, because he's starting to ask questions and he's starting to bring up topics that are way beyond his years. The story is told from the perspective of Matthew's parents as they're having to deal with the reality that this Chocky is starting to prove itself to be a little bit more than imaginary. They're seeing professionals about Matthew and they're coming up with all sorts of different theories for what might be going on, but I would say at the bottom of it, they're really just worried that they might be losing their son. And that's something I really liked about this book. I really liked that the mystery of this story was being unraveled from the perspective of a concerned parent. It's a pretty short read with very little wasted time. And I think if you find this premise interesting, then maybe give it a look, I would say that it delivers on pretty much everything that you would want from a story like this. And it also throws some really great curveballs along the way as well. I really loved this book, and in particular, I really liked the last 3 or 4 chapters, because this is not the type of sci-fi that's going to leave you with a bunch of unanswered questions. And I felt that the way that Wynbdham decided to wrap everything up was very satisfying. Moving on now to the graphic novel that I read. This one is called David Boring. This was a blind buy for me because I just really liked the title and I liked the artwork. And it's written by Daniel Clowes, who also wrote Ghost World, which you may know of because of the popular movie adaptation. I remember seeing Ghost World, but I don't actually remember anything about it. So I went into this with basically no expectations. And I gotta say, I really enjoyed this, and I feel like I really lucked out by taking a chance on this one. David Boring is basically about a sex-obsessed teenage boy who, despite being obsessed with sex, he also seems to be completely dispassionate about it too. On one hand, it's almost like having sex is just a way for him to take a personal inventory of his life. But then on the other hand, it also seems like there's just nothing that's more important to him. And, he kind of sees sex as this perfect thing. And for that reason, I found him to be a rather confusing character. He's almost like a walking contradiction. It's a bit difficult to describe what kind of book this is, actually, because it really is quite diverse. The focus of the narrative changes drastically multiple times throughout the whole thing. And the way that it moves from one point to the next is very abrupt. At some points, David is tracking down women that he admires, and at other points, he's tracking down lost family members. There are characters that also mysteriously go missing, and there are some characters that mysteriously get murdered. So if I had to categorize this book, I would probably chalk it up to some kind of alternative mystery novel with some dreamlike qualities to it as well. I would also say it's a pretty upsetting story. It's a disturbing one, so maybe it's not for everyone. But for me personally, I think this is probably one of the better graphic novels that I've ever read. And since I went into this blind, I feel comfortable in encouraging you to do the same, or at least to go into it with limited knowledge. It seems like David Boring is just one part of a greater series of comics that Clowes wrote called 8 Ball. And now that I've read this one, I think I would like to check out the rest of them, because this really was quite a surprise for me. I really liked this one. David Boring gets an emphatic stamp of approval from me, and I would highly recommend it to anybody who is interested in fringe comic books. And that's all for this video. I just wanted to try something a little bit different and cover a couple things in brief, you know. Not that any of my videos are very long anyway. Usually I would give more of a personal reflection in my videos, but this time around I don't feel like going into too much detail about that stuff. But in short, I would just say that Chocky was more of a pensive read for me, and it got me thinking about the potential for alien life as well as the potential for human progress. And David Boring was more of a shocking and visceral kind of experience for me. It wasn't a relatable story at all, nor do I think this would be relatable for very many people. But what I would say, it was more like going down a very dark and very strange rabbit hole.